It's time for another low-budget binge. I have an anthology, a triple threat of homages, and we once again pay a visit to the terrifying toy box of Robert the Doll. Let's start binging. Welcome back to ML Miller Frights. I'm ML Miller. Before we begin, please do me a favor and punch that like button down below. Share this video with all of your social media addicted pals. Click subscribe to this channel and ring that bell for notifications. Low Budget Binge is where we venture down the path less traveled and look at low budget, no budget, and sometimes international films that never get that top billing you see with the usual Hollywood fare. I'll indicate in the review down below where you can find these films along with their trailers. Here we go. Robert and the Toymaker, aka The Toymaker, or Robert 3, is available streaming on Tubi. It's directed and written by Andrew Jones. When we last saw Robert the Doll at the end of The Curse of Robert, he was returned to his maker, an elderly toymaker played by Lee Bain. This installment takes place during the height of World War II in Germany. A Nazi defector desperately roams the countryside. In his possession is a book containing ancient occult spells and rituals. The defector takes refuge in a farmer's home, and when discovered, the farmer's daughter transports the book onto the doorstep of the Toymaker. At his wit's end, with his shop in danger of closing due to the Nazi occupation, the Toymaker reads the book and brings life to a trio of dolls: a girl doll named Isabel, a clown doll named Otto, and our favorite Willem Dafoe doll, Robert. When the Nazis track down the Toymaker, it's up to Robert and his dolly pals to rescue him and kick some Nazi ass. The one thing you can count on, if you want to shift your villain towards redemption, find a worse villain for them to take on. So of course, the go-to ultimate villains are going to be Nazis, for the cursed doll who has spent 2 movies so far killing innocent people simply because they happen to be near him. I don't know why returning filmmaker Andrew Jones decided to give Robert some kind of redemption arc, but he goes for the ultimate turn by putting him against the worst people in history. Robert and the Toymaker takes a page from the Puppet Master movie series playbook by going back in time and planting its roots in World War II. Turns out Robert is the product of Nazi occultism, which is fine. I'm not against it. The real-life Robert the Doll is rumored to be made in Germany, so in some way this horror series is still adhering to the lore around the real doll that is still taking up residence in a museum in Florida. The thing is, Andrew Jones shoots for the moon and attempts to do an Inglourious Basterds-esque film rather than a killer doll story here. So much of this film desperately wants to be a Tarantino film, it sometimes hurts to watch it. Robert and the Toymaker begins with a 30-plus minute long sequence that is Robert free. Instead, it recreates the opening scene in Inglourious Basterds as Nazi officers enter a farmer's home and slowly interrogates him and his family in order to find the Nazi defector. This scene is not necessarily bad. The acting from the farmer and his wife, played by Jonathan Willis and Ali Rodney, respectively, as well as the chief Nazi inquisitor, Colonel Ludolf von Alvensleben, played by Eric Hayden, are actually quite good. And though the scene is killer doll free, they hold their own and make the scene full of suspense. But this is a killer doll movie, not a Tarantino-esque movie. And the scenes where the interrogator tells a quaint little story that vaguely relates to the situation and reveals a bit of character along the way felt out of place and extremely overlong, especially when the book is passed 3 times before it gets to the Toymaker and we finally get to Robert. After a brief bit with Robert attacking one of the toy store clerks, it's back to another overlong interrogation with another accompanying story. And then, after Robert gains 2 dolly friends, there's another interrogation. These scenes are repetitious and redundant. The opening scene establishes these Nazis to be bad, but do we really need almost an hour of these scenes in a 90-minute movie to establish that? I don't think so. These extended scenes are with long dramatic pauses and diatribes galore feel like the filmmaker Andrew Jones was padding the film in order to get it to be feature length. There simply isn't enough story here for one movie. And while some of the scenes with Robert and his doll friends are effectively creepy, that doesn't make up for the fact that they are hardly in the film at all. I like Andrew Jones's nods to other genres and real-life horrors that he peppers into this installment. The style and pattern of the dress worn by Isabel is based on Talkie Tina from an episode of The Twilight Zone called Living Doll, and the clown doll, Otto, sports makeup that looks exactly like the clown makeup serial killer John Wayne Gacy wore. The clown doll is especially creepy with its dead eyes and blank demeanor covered by clown makeup. The next installment of the Robert the Doll series takes Robert, Isabel, Otto, and the Toymaker on a train filled with Nazis, where they can once again slash and murderize the hell out of these krauts, like mini Hugo Stiglitzes. Though I haven't seen it yet, it really feels like Andrew Jones broke one script into two segments, this and the next installment, The Revenge of Robert the Doll, yet didn't have enough story to fill the runtime for the first one. I'll know if this is true next time when I check in on Robert in The Revenge of Robert the Doll. Moon of the Blood Beast is new streaming on Tubi. It's directed and written by Dustin Ferguson. A vicious beast rises once every 10 years to feast on the locals and does so over and over in this bizarre low-budget creature feature. I admire what Dustin Ferguson is attempting to do here. Basically, this is a very thin setup that resembles the Jeepers Creepers lore with a creature that returns every so often to go on a feeding frenzy, followed by the same scene over and over again with a different person or set of people getting stalked and attacked by the monster. Every scene is shot through a reddened filter of the creature's POV. Every scene ends with a dead body covered in blood. Some of them have a trail of blood running from their nether parts. Others are simply bathed in the stuff. The creature's motivation is never really delved into. We know the monster is a town secret, and the sheriff is somehow savvy to the monster's rampage, but that's about all we're given to work with as far as why this monster kills, what it kills for, and why it exists. In the middle of this film, which clocks in at less than an hour, there's an extensive scene from low-budget genre film star Donna Lee Heising, who is watching 1976 track of The Moon Beast on TV. I guess this might suggest that there's some kind of connection between these two films, especially given that so much of Track of the Beast is shown in Moon of the Blood Beast, but none of it is really explained. Both have monsters roaming the prairie and stalking people, but the creatures don't really look similar at all. Speaking of the monster, if you're looking for that awesome gnarly beast on the poster of Moon of the Blood Beast, you won't find it in the movie itself. It also looks nothing like the monster from Track of the Moon Beast, which seems to be a cross between Bigfoot and the creature of the Black Lagoon. This blood beast looks more like some guy running around wearing a bad Halloween mask of the horned Davaronian alien from the Star Wars cantina scene. There's no articulation and no real sense to the way the monster looks. Since half the movie fails to show it and chooses to show it through the monster's POV, it builds anticipation to actually see the beast by the end. Once the bad look of the monster is shown, it turns out to be completely disappointing and makes you wish that they would have just stuck to the POV shots and never shown the monster. In terms of story, there really isn't one. In order to have a story, you really have to have a lead character, and this one doesn't have it. A series of monster attack scenes are fine, but they needed to be tied together with some kind of protagonist. But apart from a sheriff and a cowboy mercenary who appear twice in the film, it's just a random parade of one slaughter after another. Moon of the Blood Beast has its heart in the right place. It's obvious there's a love for low-budget monster movies and creature features of old. Even though those films were highly flawed, they still followed the basic blueprint of writing fiction with a protagonist to follow and a beginning, middle, and end. Moon of the Blood Beast not only doesn't deliver those basics, but it also leads up to reveal a very lackluster monster. I'd love to have loved this film, but while it provides some fun imagery and a good heart, it failed to deliver any kind of story. Tales from the Other Side is new on demand and digital download from Uncork'd Entertainment. It's directed and written by Pablo Macho Maysonet IV, Jamaal Burden, Scotty Barker, Jacob Cooney, Lucas Heyne, Kern Saxton, Frank Merle, Gordon Bressack, James Cullen Bressack, and Zack Ward. I'm always a fan of anthologies, and Tales from the Other Side is a low-budget one worth seeking out simply because of the talent behind it. James Cullen Bressack is the madman behind the Jennifer films, along with his father Gordon Bressack, he's produced some very cool low-budget features. The Bressacks have teamed with Zack Ward, best known as Scott Farkas from A Christmas Story, but has made a new career producing and starring in some impressive horror films of late, like Freddy vs. Jason, Don't Blink, and the Z Nation series. While low budget, there are some very fun ideas in this collection of 7 short stories. One thing I noticed about the film is that I feel it might have wanted to start out to be a kid-friendly horror film, as the wraparound Scary Mary is very Goosebumps-esque. A group of kids decide to knock on the door of the creepy house in their town that is supposed to be occupied by a witch. Turns out it's just an old lady who likes to tell scary stories to kids. But while she fattens them up with treats, she tells the rest of the short tales that make up this anthology. While this is a perfectly workable way to frame an anthology, it did feel a bit too Saturday morning cartoonish, even though a few curse words are tossed in there for good measure. The problem is that while some of the horrors to come are kid-friendly, others really aren't, so don't be deceived that this might be appropriate for the younger folk. Petrified Boy is a fun little tale about a carnival that owns what they say is a cursed body of a petrified child in its exhibit, and woe to the person who allows sunlight to fall upon this decrepit, desiccated corpse. While the subject matter is quite morbid, I found this one to be charming and possessing a devious little edge to it. It's perplexing that this film turns out to be a story within a story, as it takes place as itself a story within a story. It's set at a garage sale containing all kinds of weird stuff, and that would have been an interesting wraparound to introduce the stories in this anthology as well. This is the same case with Flicker, the second segment where an editor with Hollywood dreams gets a job making memorial videos at a cemetery. Again, the setting would make for a good wraparound segment, with each of the videos he's editing telling a devious story. Again, a missed opportunity occurs, and the would-be filmmaker runs afoul of the ghosts that occupy the old photos he is splicing together. I found this one to be kind of predictable, but it does have a fun appearance by Road Warrior's Vernon Wells. Crystal Ball is definitely not for the kiddies, as it features a young couple looking for thrills who steal a crystal ball from a carnival psychic. Of course, nothing good comes from that. I like this one because it shuffled around who is the aggressor and who is the victim in this relationship, plus the acting is pretty solid, making it one of the more emotionally resonant ones of the bunch. Either Or is my favorite of the bunch because it was full of twists and turns. Not only is the script unpredictable, but it really delves pretty deeply into God complexes, multiple personalities, delusions, and how religious miracles might be perceived if they were to happen today. The Doom Generation and Donnie Darko's James Duval plays a patient in a mental ward who believes he's being spoken to by God. I've liked the simple visuals as well as the well-written script of this one. Blood Red feels like a truncated thriller that one might have seen on Cinemax in the 90s, most likely starring Billy Zane or Wings Hauser. It's about a sultry seductress who charms an up-and-coming painter to murder her famous artist husband. Back and front stabbings happen at a breakneck pace. Not my favorite one, but a fun one nevertheless. Finally, there's the stop-motion madness of Krampus vs. Elf. This is the type of short one might have seen at Spike and Mike's Sick and Twisted Festival back in the day. While the animation is rudimentary, as a happy elf has a gory showdown with a Krampus that comes to ruin Christmas, it's definitely effectively creepy and all sorts of wrong. So Tales from the Other Side isn't the best, but it's far from the worst anthology I've ever gandered at. It's got a couple of high points and a couple of ideas that might have needed a little more time in the cooker, but isn't that the case with most anthologies? It has a few stories worth watching, even though the tone seems to be all over the place. I'm giving a mild recommendation for this one. Sewer Gators is new on DVD, on demand, and digital download from By the Horns Films. It's directed and written by Paul Dale. As a small town in Louisiana prepares to have their annual alligator festival, a series of unexplained deaths lead investigators to believe there are alligators in the sewers that crawl up through the pipes and eat people ass first through their toilets. Only a sheriff, a scientist, and a hunter have what it takes to take on the crocodilian menace and save the city. You've got to admire a film whose tagline is "Don't crap alone." Sewer Gators is the best kind of low-budget cinema. It's completely self-aware as to what it is, a spoof of Alligator, which itself is a knockoff of Jaws. It references both films, mostly Jaws, but knows that it is being made by amateurs on a very low budget. And it rolls with it, and still manages to entertain nevertheless. The real thing that saves Sewer Gators is its extremely strong sense of humor. There are some very funny scenes, and the cast, while most likely locals, have strong comic chops. Numerous times I found myself laughing at the lo-fi attempts at scares that are so obviously bad CG or rubber alligators you might find at your local beach shop. Though the quality of the alligator effects might be low, the comedy level is higher than it should be. The film borrows from Jaws and Alligator almost beat for beat. But even though I have seen and loved those films deeply, I still manage to find the homages and out-and-out lifts from those films to be charming and even clever at times. So while it might be a lackluster horror movie with goofy scares and effects, I found Sewer Gators to be a high-quality comedy spoof that will entertain those who love those monster movies of yesteryear and don't take the genre too seriously. Loosen up and you'll laugh your tail off at Sewer Gators. Finally, we have Nightcaller. It's new on-demand and digital download from 123 Go Films. It's directed and written by Chad Ferrin. Clementine, played by Susan Priver, is a worker at a psychic call center who begins getting calls from a serial killer who scalps his victims. As the calls continue, the murders seem to be getting closer to Clementine, who decides to take matters into her own hands and try to figure out the identity of the killer. One look at Nightcaller, and you can tell it was made with a deep respect for horror and especially the giallo genre. It's got a witness to murder, an unseen killer saved for his black gloves, and a plot to track down and stop the killer at all costs. Not only are there structural nods to giallo, Clementine's father, Charles, played by Robert Miano, is bedridden and constantly watches old horror movies like Patrick and Dementia 13 from his bed. Littered with all kinds of horror memorabilia, this film wears its heart for horror on its sleeve, and it's quite infectious despite the film's budgetary limitations and faults. Chad Ferrin uses the LA at night atmosphere with long dark streets and tall stairs leading to unknown mysteries. Many times this felt like I was watching a film made ages ago, as it relies more on setting a mood than dazzling with quick cuts and loud noises. This could easily be shown among a collection of old thrillers from the late 80s and early 90s, and it would fit like the glove the killer wears. There are also quite a lot of gory kills and effective scenes of tension building up to these murders. While the psychic aspect reminded me of The Eyes of Laura Mars, Nightcaller pays the most homage to 1980s Maniac. There's the demented, breathy killer, the scalping, and a filthy tint to the entire film. There's almost a greasy feel to Nightcaller, as if you're watching something you shouldn't. It reminded me of watching adult horror movies as a kid and thinking I'm getting away with something, yet feeling a bit queasy about it after watching. This film succeeded in making me feel uncomfortable, and a lot of that had to do with the slightly older cast filled with obscure actors like Steve Railsback, Lou Temple, Kelly Maroney, and especially the batshit lunacy that permeates every second of Bai Ling's performance on screen. She truly is an oddity, a fascinating one I probably could watch folding linens and be totally intrigued. Towards the end of the film, when things need to be wrapped up, Nightcaller becomes convoluted and then overly simplified. There's a near-death that isn't very believable in the last act who survives being scalped, even though the rest of the victims seem to die quickly from the ordeal. Nightcaller is not a perfect film, but it does capture a certain mood, contains some very gnarly scalpings, and has a nutty cast. If you're an LA noir, giallo, thriller fan who likes their mysteries with some blood and gore, you could do much worse.
You're doomed to live the life you're meant to be, stuck inside your